I was searching for video ideas the other day when I came across something called Scratch. So I got curious and looked into it, and what I saw gave me a eureka moment. You see, I am working on an indie game and also making YouTube videos, so I don't really have time to do much aside from those two, since these two need a lot of attention to do. So it started feeling like the only videos I'll make are devlogs about that indie game, and that's where Scratch comes in. If you don't know, Scratch is a block-based programming language and website aimed primarily at children. Now, it's not a secret that I hate coding, but I can probably handle something that's aimed at 8-year-olds, right? Right? But even something like Scratch needs a bit of practice to get used to, so I decided to spend 30 hours learning Scratch. So hi, how's it going? The name's Hilarious, and so at the start of the 30 hours, I started thinking on what game I actually want to do. Now, even if Scratch is aimed at children, there are some absolute mad lads out there making Terraria and Minecraft in Scratch. So it's nice to see that even though the skill floor for Scratch is very low, the skill ceiling is also high enough to make interesting games. But I don't want to start with an arcade game or a clicker game. I want to start this journey with a bang. So I'm making a very scuffed RPG. Now, what do I mean by this? So there's this YouTuber called Magic the Noah, and he made a video about an RPG that is extremely scuffed. He basically just has like a tabletop like game in Google Docs or something with extremely luck-based combat system, and it was one of the most fun I ever had watching a YouTube video. So much fun that I actually started making my own versions of this game and played it with my friends. And it got to a point where we have classes, different bosses, monster mutations, and random events. But it was lacking one thing: automation. Since it's just a drag and drop type of game, I have to manually move players and enemies and manually adjust stats. So I decided, why not make Scuffed RPG into an actual video game using Scratch? So the first 30 minutes is just me going to Scratch, fiddling around, and realizing, I don't even know where to start. So I went to the hell where dreams are born, and dreams stay to die. The tutorial hell. Now, I said before that Scratch is aimed at children, right? But it hasn't really hit me yet. So I was scrolling YouTube trying to find how I can do the game, and I saw a chess tutorial. Now I thought to myself, I do want the game to have draggable movement that's limited to tiles. Kind of like chess. So I clicked it. And I don't know about you, but when I go to these types of videos with a very straightforward idea, just showing what you did in an engine, I'm sorry, but okay, I'm expecting a grown-ass man, and the first thing I heard was this.
Hello guys, welcome back to another Scratch tutorial on how to make chess. So in here, we've got a project, and if you press the green flag,
that is a literal child. So after watching a bit on how people work on Scratch, and getting schooled by an 8-year-old, I started working on the game for real this time. So I made a checklist on all the things I wanted to do for the game, from the map all the way to playtesting. So the first thing to do was make a map, or a layout on what the game actually would look like. As far as I know, Scratch does not really have a built-in camera system, so I'm stuck in this 4x3 square to make my game. Now I'm sure there was a way to switch screens with backdrops and such, but with my first game, I didn't really want to overthink it too much, so I made this. This area would be the actual environment where players and enemies are going to be, with different tiles like the village, where the players start, the bad and good tiles, the caves where the monsters spawn, and the boss and mini-boss areas. This part is where the different buttons and how to control the game would be. This is for the player stats, where you can see their strength and gold, which are the only stats in the game. And this is also where the items would go. And this is for a shop. Now we would go in depth in all of these as we develop them one by one. So the first thing I coded was enemies. So I took a slime sprite I already had to prototype something quick. And with trying to figure out how enemies would move and spawn randomly, I saw one line of code that will be overused for the next 30 hours. The pick random block. And with this, I can set random results that are tied to different places in the map where enemies can then spawn and move to randomly. And it was working great. There was just one major flaw. You see this tile right here? That is not a separate object that I can put code in. That is part of the background sprite. So how did I do the spawning and movement of the enemies? I hard-coded the coordinates. Don't judge me. I only changed this flaw like 5 hours into the game when my friend, who studies computer science by the way, said, no. And I took the time to make more sprites that I need in the game, and 3 of those are enemy variants. I made a slime, a goblin, and Bob. So now they would spawn in random tiles as a random type of enemy. And I made a day system that gets updated every time all of the players have already moved. And when the new day comes, the enemies pick a random tile to go to again. I also added this very happy sun, and if you click it, it goes ahead and skips that day. Now I made enemy spawning using the create clone code. And I made it so when they start as a clone, they will only spawn in the 2 caves in the map. And they will only move after a whole day has been played through. So that's about it for the enemies. For now at least. Then the next thing I coded are wheels. I can explain. Now with Magic the Noah's version, he had the good wheel and the bad wheel. So if you lost a fight with a monster or landed in the bad tile,
now you will spin the bad wheel.
There you can get your strength and gold reduced, get sent back to the village, and other things. But if you manage to win a fight, you will spin the good wheel, where you can get buffs and items. So I thought about it for a while on how I would randomize spinning a wheel in Scratch. I searched about it, but there was not really much I saw that would be an exact fit on what I wanted. So I said to myself, you know what? Let's just use the pick random. But there was one downside to that. It was not really a wheel. It's the code for the back end of the wheel, but now making a wheel just seemed unnecessary. So instead, I made the bad and good fates. 2 icons that tell you what your fate is after a fight. I used this say code to visualize the results of the random punishment or reward. And the back end of this is just a lot of if statements, but you know, we don't talk about that. Come on. I also made these different dice and a coin flip, which would come in handy when the bad wheel says something like lose D20 gold. So you will lose the amount you spin with a D20, which is a die that has 20 sides, by the way, if someone out there doesn't know that. So 5 hours into the game, I probably procrastinated the players enough by now, so I also added them in the game. I created 3 character designs that are based on my friends. One is a Monsieur Man, one is a golden hamster, and yes, I am friends with a golden hamster, and a fish. That's me. But you can only drag them around and they do nothing so far, so let's start by adding combat. The initial design I had for combat was when a player goes to a tile with an enemy, you would click this ready button to edit the player's strength and the enemy, and then click this button to make them fight. The code then adds both of these numbers from those 2 variables and sets it as a total power. It then picks a random number between 1 and total power, and if that random number that was picked is greater than the player's strength, the enemy wins. But if it's less, then the player wins. This would make it so the one with the higher strength has the luck advantage, but theoretically, with this combat system, a 1 power player can still defeat a 100 power boss through sheer luck. That's the fun part of the game. Now it would stay like this for a couple of hours until I decided to make it automatic. So when the player goes to a tile and comes in contact with an enemy, and if it's that player's turn, the game detects this and instantly sets this monster as the enemy strength and this player as the player's strength. Now this created some problems that when 2 enemies are in one tile, they tend to fight over who is set as the enemy strength, but they both die when the player wins. So I just made it so only 1 enemy can be in a tile, then I put a monster count cap, so there won't be more enemies than tiles. But they do take a while to settle down sometimes. I also made 3 different sword sprites representing 3 players, but you know, looking back at it, I probably could have just used 1 sword sprite and put every code there, and just changed the costumes. Now it's time for the thing I dreaded about. Player movement. This is the moment me and that 8-year-old who coded chess was waiting for. I will make you proud. To be honest, at this point, I knew what had to be done. I just didn't know if I had the strength to do it. But I decided to buckle up and prepare for the hundreds of if statements I would need to do. So the first thing I did was to finally separate the tiles into sprites instead of it being in the backdrop. Then I made these little arrow things that only show up when you click the player and only if it is their turn. Now I connected the code of the player and the code of the arrows through broadcast message blocks. So when I click, let's say north, it broadcasts go north, and depending on where the player is, it will go north of that tile only if it is available. And only certain arrows show up depending on what tile you're currently in. Like how you cannot go to the good tile from this tile. Then I added a button to send the player back to the village and a button to skip the turn if necessary. I also made it so that these small icons would triple in size when the player they're representing is currently the one in turn. Some small tweaks I made during this time was making things sway using this code. I also made it so that the fates in the swords go to the center and enlarge when they are currently in use. I also started to make buttons that you can click to see different player strength and golds. You can even edit them in game for when the fates tell you to either increase or decrease them. And if you're curious how I'm doing this, I'm just using a variable block and showing and hiding it using these buttons. And I set them to this mode with the slider for easy editing. I made them all show up when you press E, and you can hide them by pressing space. The next thing that the player needs would be turns. So I made it so that when the player moves, their turn is declared over unless an event happens, like fighting an enemy. I also made it so that the 3 players would have randomized turns every game. So when I click this green flag, they would have a different sequence every time. And yet again, did I do this with a smart system? No. I hard-coded every combination that has 1, 2, 3. It was just 6 combinations, so I did not go insane. I also randomized what the player's strength and gold would start as, so every new game you can have 3 to 6 strength and gold depending on your luck. And luck, if you don't realize by now, is something that decides majority of what happens in this game. So guess what? With this amount of work, I am now about 15 hours into the game. Halfway through this whole challenge, and I'm still pretty happy with what we have so far. So I finally started on the shop. Mr. Pig Salesman over here has been unmentioned for far too long. So I started by making different sprites and worrying about their uses later. A very artist thing to do. So I took some inspirations on what I want to make on previous renditions of the game. In the end, I made a stick, which gives 2 power. The big sword, which gives 10 power. A Glock, which gives 15 power, of course. I also made a meteor that spawns a random meteor in the field once used, which will slay any enemy on sight. Definitely has no bugs. The next item is a monster egg that spawns an enemy in a random cave, a root spell that skips the current turn, steroids that gives a random strength buff for a random amount of rounds, and finally, an egg, which summons a pet that can help you in your journey. Now, in the previous versions of the game, I just had everything being sold at once, and the player would pick out what they want to buy. But for this game, I wanted a single slot that changes every turn, so even items are RNG in this game. So I made a buy button and a reroll button that you can use to try and win the odds of the shop. Oh, and the price at the bottom left saying how much the current item is. Now, when you buy an item in a shop, you would expect it to go to your inventory, right? But there was one problem with that, a very big problem with that approach. I don't know how to do that. So I just made it so it goes in a random X and Y coordinate between where the player's inventory was supposed to go. Yeah, this is how scuffed we're making this. And come on, what are the chances it goes in the exact same spot within hundreds of coordinates? Right? So now you can buy items and then click them in your inventory to use them. So now we're finally done with the wrong. There are 2 things we need to tackle to be truly done with the shop. The first thing is something lingering since the first hours of the game that I never mentioned. This shadowy tile right here. This is the Shadow Realm. A place you can only go to through getting banished in the battle wheel or getting beaten by specific enemies. Once you're here, you can only do one thing. Spin the Shadow Fate. Here you can only lose or go home. So when you see someone never getting out of it, you can always just click this home button that I made earlier. So when you see like the player stuck for like 15 rounds, just spare them, you know, just let them out. But why am I bringing this up now? You see, I wanted the shop to change when the current player who can move is in the Shadow Realm. So meet Mr. Shadow Piggy. He sells 4 things that can only be accessed through the Shadow Shop. A Shadow Key to get out of the Shadow Realm, a Void Cell to banish the current player so you can even use it on yourself, the Spell of Azuthal, which gives you the right to take another player's turn, and finally, a Shadow Egg. Now let's discuss these together with the normal egg, or what I like to call them, my biggest mistakes. Now, why am I being so harsh with them? Literally just because they took so much of my remaining time, and the next things that I did has to be compromised. They were a mess to code, since they're technically just more players, meaning all the movement code and the combat code had to be pasted to them, while also editing these codes to suit them. But in the end, they at least turned out great. So when you use these 2 items, they start as an unhatched egg in the village. And when another day comes, the normal egg can hatch into 3 things: a bee, a duck, and a capybara, with each of them having different abilities to match the player. The bee, with 15 power, gives its owner extra strength every time it wins, while the duck, on the other hand, has 10 power but gives gold instead. Now the capybara is a little bit special. With 10 power, every time it wins, it gains 1 more health. Now, stop right there. Health? There was never a health mechanic in the game, because when the player loses, the worst that can happen is lose some strength or get banished, right? But not the pets. Pets only have 3 lives. Once out of lives, they will vanish forever. And you can only have 1 pet at play per player. So the capybara, while being not as helpful, thrives in its perseverance. Now the shadow egg, on the other hand, can only spawn 2 shadow pets, and they are the cat, which what I like to call the established strength, with a whopping 30 power, and the knight, which I like to call the growing strength, because it will always have 75% of its owner's strength. So theoretically, it can go up to 75 strength with the maxed out owner. And with that, we are left with just 3 hours to add everything else for the game. And at this point, I was starting to feel like the enemies don't really do much, so I started making more enemy variants and giving each of them different abilities. First, the slime, with a whopping 5 power. If the slime wins a fight, it doubles in power and increases in size, but when you defeat it, you get all of its power transferred into you. Next is the Gobble, Gobble the Goblin. With 7 power, this not so friendly goblin will take 5 gold from you when it defeats you, but it drops 5 gold when slain. And a new challenger arrives. The first addition is the Mimic. This monster is something all players would want, as it gives random item to the one who slays it. It has 15 power, which makes it the strongest normal enemy in the game. The next is the Necromancer with 10 power, making it put up a decent fight. The Necromancer spawns a monster every time it wins, and spawns a comet every time it loses a fight. And last but not least, Bob. Yeah, he's also here. But kidding aside, Bob is not just a meme enemy, even if the only thing he does when he defeats you is say, lol. But the true power of Bob comes after being defeated. Once slain, Bob has a 25% chance of turning into Bob of the Abyss. The undead body of Bob rises and goes to the Shadow Realm, only to come back stronger than ever. With 30 power, Bob of the Abyss will give headaches to the players, even in the mid-game. Every time it defeats you, it sends you to the Shadow Realm, but once defeated, it will give you the essence of the Abyss, gaining you 20 plus power, setting you up for the late game. Now, while making the late game, I was about 27 hours into this whole thing, so I thought to myself, I'll just make them simple, because I don't really have much time. So I spent some time designing the Golem. The Golem is a mini-boss with an overwhelming 50 power. If it defeats you, it starts the Calamity, where monsters spawn and comets fall from the sky. But once defeated, it unlocks the way to the final boss of this game, the Sleeping Dragon. With the highest possible power of 100, the dragon stands as the final obstacle for the players. If it ever defeats you, it will resurrect the golem with half of its strength and size. So you can literally get a very small golem, an eeny weeny golem, if you lose enough to the dragon. But if one slays the dragon, the whole game closes and they are deemed the winner of Scuffed RPG. So now there's one last thing to do with the game. Playtesting. So I called my friends and tried to play Scuffed RPG. And here's how it went.
Go to Bob, go to Bob.
Go to Bob. Player strength 4. Bob's strength is... I actually don't know, I forgot. 7.
Oh, nice. He's reading what he's watching.
I nerfed him. Like, oh,
Easy.
you actually... Oh. Oh no.
Oh no.
You know what? Dang it. Oh no! Oh no! Oh god! Oh sh! Oh wait. That's
it.
12.
Ah.
No!
Alex.
Wait, why did I send that? You know what? I'm fighting this dragon. Oh. Huh? Huh? What the?
Now, I had other plans for this game, like putting classes the player can get and a multiplayer feature, but I realized along the way that I would not be able to do them in 30 hours, so if this game does well enough, I would consider updating it or maybe overhauling everything and adding these features. There was a lot of things I couldn't do, like adding sounds and proper game juice, but if you would like to try the game out for yourself, the Scratch link is in the description. It really has a lot of bugs right now, so I'm not sure if it's even playable, but hey, I learned how to do Scratch games, so I consider that as a win. If you have any ideas on what I can do next, go ahead and leave a comment, and if you enjoyed watching me suffer in this video, give it a like. And apparently, 80% of you are not subscribed. Huh? What are you doing? Huh? I see it. Let's subscribe.